All right, so those have been received, and I will review all those prior to imposing sentence. All right, any other matters we need to address at this point from the state?
No.
From the defense?
No, sir.
All right, I'll hear from the state.
Thank you, Your Honor. I want to start this afternoon by first just discussing the framework in which Your Honor is to make your decision before sentencing Aiden Fucci in this matter. When you begin with the Florida Rule of Criminal Procedure 3.781C on the sentencing of juveniles in this structure, the rule states that the court shall make, when you come back and pronounce sentence, you shall make specific findings on the record that all relevant factors have been reviewed and considered by the court prior to posing a sentence of life or a term of years equal to life. And then you are to make some findings in writing, and just one specifically as to whether the defendant is eligible for a sentence review hearing under Florida statutes. And that's based on whether the defendant killed, attempted to kill, or intended to kill the victim. So you have to make a specific finding of fact that he killed Tristyn Bailey and intended to kill her in this case, which would result in his sentencing review after 25 years. And so that has to be writing. Subsection 2 doesn't apply to him because he doesn't have a prior offense enumerated. And 3 just says that a copy of your written findings about his review hearing, judge, have to be made part of the packet that goes to DOC with him ultimately.
Let me just back you up.
Yep.
Go back to that slide. As far as the court's determination that he killed, attempted to kill, or intended to kill the victim, is that based on the evidence that you're asking the court to make a factual determination from the evidence, or is it also from his guilty plea, and was that stipulated to prior to this hearing?
That wasn't stipulated to. I mean, he did enter a guilty plea. So I obviously think we're in a much different posture than obviously a jury would be making a pure factual finding. But no, you should make your own factual finding. It's why we presented the evidence we did for the record here now, for you to make that finding and for any future future court. So you do have to make that specific finding.
All right.
And we believe we provided the evidence for you to do that. And then obviously, judge, the factors. We've heard this statute number a lot, obviously, in the last couple of days, and we've all been listening and hearing about the factors. And what I want to do now is talk about those and the evidence related to each factor and why that evidence means that the court should, in this case with Aiden Fucci, impose a life sentence. That based on all of these factors, even after reviewing everything, the appropriate sentence for Aiden Fucci is still life. And so when you review these factors, it starts with A, and right at the top, the nature and circumstances of the offense. You know, everybody knows the saying that pictures are worth 1,000 words, and that's very true. Even without the pictures, the testimony of Dr. Fulcher painted a picture of this crime alone. But I know you will never forget those photos. What those photos factually showed, and through Dr. Fulcher's testimony, is that there were 114 stab wounds. 49 of those were defensive. And then you see, and you've heard the other numbers here, 35 or more to her head and neck, and 29 throughout the rest of her body. When considering the nature of the crime, what was also important from Dr. Fulcher was to know and learn that she was conscious and alive for this attack. We know that obviously from at least 49 defensive wounds. She was fighting. Another important factor about this particular murder is the high degree of force that was used and would have been necessary to cause these wounds, the amount of wounds, and specifically Dr. Fulcher talked about there's a high degree of force that's needed to penetrate someone's head, make slice marks in her skull, chip out bone in her skull, and ultimately break off the tip of a knife. That takes a high amount of force that this defendant used to carry out this crime, and then the pure number of wounds, Your Honor. And 6 fatal wounds. And he described that death and what happens when the lungs collapse. And he also went further when you had to view the photos and some of the internal organ photos. There's a purpose for those. He described to you that those injuries you saw in her lungs and the hemorrhage, medical term for the blood pooling, the hemorrhage around those, what that tells him is she was conscious, she was alive, and there was a heartbeat throughout that process. And we know she was conscious because she's defending herself. So none of these wounds were post-mortem. That's the nature of the physical crime. The circumstances are even more horrific. And that includes several things, but most importantly, the circumstances that led up to this crime was the defendant's verbalization that he wanted to do it. If he was going to kill somebody, he would plan it. It's what he told Sophie, his most closest friend and girlfriend in his life. He said it would be at night, he would drag somebody in the woods, and he would stab them. And he said it would be soon, within a month. He said he would act innocent, keep killing, and then run away. The nature and circumstances, just factually alone, is horrific and some of the worst that this court could probably imagine. And then you put it in context through this group of juveniles that you're supposed to consider, juveniles that commit murder. And who helps you do that? Dr. Gregory Pritchard. And so he is called in to talk about the nature and circumstances of this offense and how does that compare? Because that's what the court's ultimately being asked to do. You're given discretion now. You can't just hand a life sentence out for first-degree murder to a juvenile. You can't. You're asked to weigh 8 factors about the juvenile and to weigh the offense. And so that's the purpose in this type of testimony. And so Dr. Pritchard told this court, that this act was extremely unique and extremely violent for anyone to commit, let alone a juvenile. And I think Dr. Bloomfield today eventually admitted that. Yes, I think anyone would say this is unique. And of course they would. But it's also statistically unique. It's not just a layperson's view at uniqueness, but Dr. Pritchard, with his vast experience in seeing these types of crimes, and that's backed up by the statistics. The U.S. Department of Justice tracks this information, and only 7% of all the juveniles in the U.S. in crime statistics that were arrested were even arrested for violent offenses, and only 1% of those were homicide. So homicide alone with juveniles is unique. And then you look at the type and nature and circumstance of this crime, which is obviously extremely unique and different to other murders that could be committed and are often committed by juveniles. He described it as an outlier and unusual. And when you read Miller v. Alabama and some of the cases that come after that, Horsley v. State with the Florida Supreme Court, they talk about those, that there will be juveniles that will deserve a life sentence. There will be those cases, which is why it's on the table, Your Honor. There will be outliers. There will be incorrigible juveniles that deserve the worst punishment, and Aiden Fucci is one of those. The second factor, Your Honor, is the effect of the crime on the victim's family and on the community. I know it's been made clear to you from yesterday to today, there's no way to measure the effect. Tristyn Bailey was a daughter, a granddaughter, a sister, a friend. She was a great friend, it sounds like, to many peers. A good student, a good athlete, a leader on her cheer team. And it sounds like she was a positive influence in her school community, would have been in the world. Someone referred to her and said that, we want to go on and be the light. That's what Tristyn was. And so this family has lost something immeasurable. And it's not only the family, and the statutes tell you can consider the loss on the community, and you've heard a lot about that, and I'm sure you will and continue to read the letters that came in from local community and beyond, people that were touched by this case one way or the other because they knew the family, knew Tristyn, or knew someone affected. And there was over 100 letters submitted outside of this family. This has been an extremely unique case that's touched this community in a unique way. You heard from Mr. Bailey today about the number of vigils, memorials, the support shown through, ribbons and everything the community did, certain businesses that opened up their place for his family and showed support in various ways. This has obviously had an enormous effect on the family and the community, and I think it really goes without saying, and all the evidence is clear on that. One of the other factors that we spent a lot of time on, Judge, along with another one that'll come later, and these really get to who Aiden Fucci is and who was he, trying to understand the juvenile and trying to understand why he committed this particular crime, what led up to, or just really, was this an impetuous crime, or is this different? Again, under that framework of all juveniles are immature, a lot of them will take risks. They will make bad decisions, certainly. But is this murder just that? Or is this something different? And so this is a factor that helps you with that, Your Honor. And we've already gone over some of this already. We know he was young. You've heard the testimony about maturity as compared to his peer group. I want to comment on intellectual capacity. You heard a lot about that through both psychologists in this case, and I just wanted to point out, and I think Dr. Bloomfield finally conceded this point earlier when he just testified, that there's no evidence of a cognitive deficit, aka an intellectual disability, in Aiden Fucci. You heard the testimony through Dr. Pritchard of how the teachers described it. It was more academic and a lack of motivation. That's completely two different things. And Dr. Bloomfield even had to agree to that point today. He was designated SLD, which means his performance was not up to par where they would expect him to be, and that was based on a learning disability. His last IEP was done right before this homicide. He was on track to earn a standard diploma. And then you heard about the behavioral issues in school which start to go to this mental and emotional health at the time. And again, we're comparing him to like peers. We're comparing him to juveniles in general. And this juvenile had overall 22 disciplinary referrals. Testimony in the records showed several suspensions. And again, Dr. Pritchard has information and relies on general information about juveniles when saying this is an outlier. Only 5 to 7% of students, K through 12, in their whole life get suspended one time. And this is obviously a teen who had continuous disciplinary problems, behavioral problems, some of them violent, threatening to throw another student out a window, fighting, disrespect. Dean Wetchen said he definitely didn't like to be disrespected, and he had a huge problem with authority. So that is who Aiden Fucci is at this time. And again, Dean Wetchen commented he's more mature than his peers. He's been in the education system for 35 years. He's clearly comparing him to his peer group. And he said he's mature and he had his problems, but he knew what to do. And what's the point of bringing that up? All of these teachers were asked, and I believe I went through this with Dr. Pritchard, you had all of his 8th grade teachers essentially and the dean interviewed, and they all stated he knew the difference between right and wrong. He knew how to react. Yes, he had a learning disability. We're not talking about that. But he knew and he understood consequences, and he was able to make changes. It's just whether he wanted to or not. And that's the general sense that the teachers and then Dean Wetchen gives about Aiden Fucci. And then you have Mr. Barton from DJJ, obviously another person with experience in talking with juveniles. And he, again, said he's more mature than others, that Aiden Fucci never complained to him about any abuse in his life or abuse at the jail or being beat up by inmates, guards, or otherwise. And he never said that he was suicidal while he was in the jail. And this was somebody who was visiting him regularly to check on him, and it was the same type of well-being check every time. This would have been someone Aiden Fucci could have talked to had that been something of concern with him. And then the statutes ask you to look at his family and his background. And so, Dr. Pritchard commented, it's someone unremarkable and normal. Well, he's looking at that from, his world and criminal persons that end up in the criminal justice system. And he said it's, quote, normal from the perspective of we often see defendants and juveniles specifically that are committed awful crimes, and they suffer from poverty and extreme abuse in their life, sexual abuse, neglect, and all of these things, and that's just absent here. It's absent here, and that is consistent with all the family accounts. The grandmother, Miss Spywak, she describes him growing up in a loving home, mainly with his mom. His parents were separated, and she said Jason Fucci never missed a weekend with his child. Did he discipline him? Sure. Had Aiden told her about that? Oh, Dad's going to discipline me more than Mom. And he had verbalized a few things to Sophie Bauman about that, but outside of that, outside of being disciplined when he misbehaved, there's no reports, no evidence of any sort of unusual, neglectful, abuseful home. He had it all, according to Grandma. He was spoiled. And the brothers felt the same way about being raised in that house. And so then we get to immaturity, impetuosity, which has obviously been a big thing that we've been talking about the last couple days, and failure to appreciate risks and consequences. Dr. Pritchard doesn't attribute immaturity to the commission of this offense, and that's what's important. It's a fact that Aiden Fucci was 14. It's a fact that he's a juvenile and less mature than adults. What matters was the crime, was the act a result of an immature, impetuous decision or behavior? And no, the evidence is overwhelming that it is just not in this case. And Dr. Pritchard gave good real-life examples where if he was asked as a psychologist, he would have to say, well, yeah, this is different. And he gave a good example of a juvenile who goes into a store to rob it, carrying a gun to scare people, but never intended to kill. And that clerk does something, makes a movement, does something that causes that juvenile to react in that moment and make an impetuous, stupid, horrible decision and kill that clerk, run out of the store. That is a very, very different crime than what we have here. And I'm sure we can all think of similar acts like that by juveniles. Juvenile makes out with their friends and people are drinking and they're partying, and a juvenile gets on the hood of a car and someone drives them around, that juvenile falls off and gets killed. I mean, these are the examples of risky behavior, impetuous behavior, juveniles not thinking of consequences. And there's dozens more examples like that can be contrasted with the homicide of Tristyn Bailey and what Aiden Fucci did in this case. Dr. Pritchard said there is evidence in this case that although there's the general understanding about these juvenile brain developments, that he can generally understand risk. He's not one of those people who just can't grasp it, that they don't understand. There's a difference. We know it because he told Sophie Bauman that when he killed, he would run away, cover it up, and keep killing. We know from other life events in school, that when he got in trouble or when he felt he was about to get in trouble in a classroom, he would ask to excuse himself and go to Dean Wetchin. He knew, if I do this, I'm going to get in trouble, I'm going to leave, and I'm going to go vent to Dean Wetchin. So Aiden Fucci understands consequences. Generally, it's clear as well as any other juvenile. And then after the murder, Dr. Pritchard attributed his actions into whether this was an impetuous offense by talking about what he did after. No, he knew what consequences were because he immediately hid a murder weapon so he wouldn't be caught with it on his way home. He went right up into his room, as evidenced by that video. He hid the shoes and white shirt behind his dresser. He immediately went in a shower, spent a decent amount of time in that shower, washing evidence off his body. He snuck through that house quietly so nobody would find him or hear him coming home. He did things. He knew he had just done something wrong, and he was trying to cover it up. And then he lies. This isn't impetuous behavior. Your Honor, we know that he was the sole participant in this homicide. It's overwhelming, but it explains why we put forth some of the evidence we did, obviously the premeditated statements. The other reason we, large in part, introduced all the video surveillance was just to prove that he is the only person who was walking with Tristyn Bailey. He's the only person. He did this alone, and then we know all of the evidence related to this homicide ended up in his bedroom and in a pond nearby. There's no evidence of any pressure on Mr. Fucci to commit this crime by anybody else. One of the other factors, Judge, is criminal history. He has none. And then the effect of his youth on his judgment. And some of these factors, Judge, overlap, but essentially Dr. Pritchard and Dr. Bloomfield agree. Youth affects judgment. Yes, we talked about that. That's the lens you're to look at him through. But what did Dr. Pritchard say about Aiden Fucci? He has personal dynamics, personal features that make him unusual and dangerous. Dr. Pritchard testified that he has clinical concerns that something is seriously wrong with Aiden Fucci, and in a bad way. It goes beyond poor judgment. It goes beyond youth with this individual and this crime. Obviously, that's why he made such a point of the unusual preoccupation with death and killing. That's not youth and poor decision making. Again, it's a preoccupation with death, and unfortunately here he carried that out. And then finally, Judge, the possibility of rehabilitating the defendant. And this is a factor to consider in sentencing him, and when you review some of the case law on these post-milligram sentencings, this is a factor. It's not as weighty as it is in resentencing juveniles 25 years from now. Things sort of flip when they get reviewed. A lot of emphasis is put on rehabilitation, but it is something for the court to consider now based on the information we would have to this point. And so that's all the doctors could speak to. Dr. Pritchard told you that he believes there's a poor prognosis based on what he's seen thus far. And that's all he can say. And he told you why he felt that. He told you, that behavior right after the homicide, his actions in the back of the patrol car and laughing, just the callous behavior that he exhibited when he was the only person in the world who knew where Tristyn was and that she was laying in the woods, dead from his actions. His demeanor in the interview room, just showing he's calm. He's asking his parents, what does this have to do with me? Why am I here? Not even looking, told his parents he wasn't scared. Not really. And then, of course, his behavior in the jail and all of the extortion and threats to guards and other inmates. So not just the fact that a juvenile inmate gets in a fight. Of course, those things happen. But what Dr. Pritchard found unique and concerning about Aiden Fucci is that he would brag about his crime, the specifics of his crime, in a way to boast him up and get what he wanted. So I don't shoot my victims. I stab them face to face. You know, using his actual crime to manipulate, fight, scare others, exert dominance is different than just juveniles getting in fights in jail. And so he's done nothing to this point to exhibit any sort of desire, care, remorse to change anything about his future behavior. And so, Your Honor, just going back to what we were talking about in the beginning, the framework. And this is just the statute number. 775.082 1B1 is where it states that when you make the finding that Aiden Fucci was the one who actually killed and intended to kill Tristyn Bailey, he will be entitled to a review hearing in accordance to the statute. And that statute says that he is entitled to review after 25 years. So we've already gone over some of this stuff. You have to make it in writing. He admitted it again, and all of the evidence we've supported and put forward in this case supports that. Your Honor, the decision that you have before you is one of discretion. And like I said earlier, if Aiden Fucci was an adult, there would be no discretion, there would be no conversation. It wouldn't have mattered if he walked in a store and shot a clerk once, or he did what he did to Tristyn Bailey. It would be a life sentence. But because of everything that's happened through our courts and the medically and psychologically accepted science, that gives you discretion. And the state of Florida has laid out those factors, and it now requires you to look. It's stating a fact, and we're legally accepting a fact, and you have to look through that lens and make an individual decision about Aiden Fucci. And so that's why the look that Dr. Pritchard did in this case, not just coming to educate you about the juvenile brain, we understand that, but to actually dig in and look at the evidence and try to apply it and then compare it across his peer group and draw differences and come to a conclusion. Is he unique? Is he an outlier? And does he deserve the harshest punishment out there? And that's why they tell you to do an individualized sentencing. And all the evidence that we brought you, and especially through Dr. Pritchard, should help you do that. And all that evidence has really shown us who Aiden Fucci is. And we all know that juveniles confide more. It's common sense. Juveniles confide more in their friends and their peers than they're going to confide in parents and teachers sometimes, and he did that. Aiden Fucci told his closest friends and his girlfriend his most innermost thoughts and desires. And he told them that real life violence was his interest. He wanted to know. He wanted to kill someone and do it by stabbing them, which is clearly different than shooting someone, and it causes much suffering. He knew how, and he knew when he was going to do it. How he was going to do it is he was going to take someone in the woods, just like that, and he was going to kill him. He was going to stab them until they died. That's what we knew. We knew he knew how. We knew that he knew when, that it would be soon. And unfortunately, Judge, his when ended up being May 9th of 2021. And his who ended up being Tristyn Bailey. And for all of the evidence that we presented in this case, all of the factors, and showing you how those factors show you who Aiden Fucci is, the uniqueness of this crime, all of that shows you that this particular juvenile should be sentenced to the harshest penalty possible, which is life in prison, and he will be entitled to a 25-year review. And he will have a chance to attempt to rehabilitate himself and prove himself at that time. Thank you.
Thank you.